going back, go back to go forward. Going backward to go forward, go back to go forward. My great-grandpa Cahoon, ran that tavern. He ran that tavern maybe even through Prohibition. He might have. My great-grandpa Cahoon had to send a man out of that tavern one day. That man had said some rude things to the ladies. Great-grandpa Cahoon sent that man right out. Well, that man didn't like being sent out. He wanted my great-grandpa to know it. So that man stopped outside, and he put his face right up on the window of that tavern. He put his nose right up on that glass. And my great-grandpa Cahoon, if you knew him, well, he did what you might expect great-grandpa Cahoon to do. He punched that man right on the nose, right through the glass of that tavern. That was my great-grandpa Cahoon. We carry many things with us. We carry things. We carry the sins and the blessings of our families. Now listen carefully, because the Bible is clear. God does not punish us for other people's mistakes. However, the Bible is also clear that the world simply works this way, and that what we all know to be true is true, that we carry many things with us, the sins and the blessings. I think of this. I think of my family as you probably do. I think of them often. I think of my Grandma Jameson. I think of her love of words and grammar and language, her mastery of crossword puzzles and of French. I think of it because I fell in love with many of those things as well, with poetry, and I still play word games on my phone, and as my sister and I learned Spanish, I thought of my Grandma Jameson. I thought of my Grandpa Jameson. I think of him. I think of how he was small but had a wiry and strong frame and an active chemist's mind. I think of the grit of my Grandpa Carter, who, praise God, is still living. Grandpa Carter, who is Captain Carter, captain on the Great Lakes on the freighters for decades. I think of how he served in World War II, and he served because he lied about his age, which was 17. And while serving in the Pacific, I think of his grit as he had to sew the tip of his own finger back on. I think of how he lost so many friends in that time, which was a piece of him that cannot be sewn back on. I think of my Grandma Carter, and I think of pink. Really, I picture more of a bright shade of mauve. I think of how she raised her brothers through the Depression, who were not easy. She was the Cahoon family. How she threw the best parties, and how she was queen of the kitchen. I think of the baked good boxes that showed up for me, in brown boxes full of baked goods that showed up for me when I was in college, that showed up for my sister before me, and showed up for my dad before us many years before, although he didn't get to eat many of his because the other boys in his dorm figured out what those boxes meant, and they usually didn't make it to him. So we carry these wonderful stories with us. And we also carry the wounds, things that ripple through families as well as ripple through communities. Of the tragic death of one of my grandma's brothers, her favorite. Of how my Grandpa Carter grew up away from his parents as they were separated during the Depression out of necessity. Of the silence in my mom's own family growing up. I asked her recently, what was your favorite birthday memory? I don't know, she said. We didn't really celebrate things well in my family. Or the long absences that the freighter schedule took my grandpa away from my dad, my aunt, and my grandma for long, long periods of time. I would be a fool to ignore how all of these things shaped me. And you would be foolish to ignore how all of the stories, the sins and the blessings of your family continue to shape you. The Bible is clear that things work this way. In fact, if you read through the book of Genesis in particular, although you can pick several different books of the Bible to look at this, but the last 2/3, I should say, of the book of Genesis is this is one of the main themes of that. How this stuff gets passed down through families, how the patterns and habits of the family go on and on through the story, from Abraham all the way to Joseph. And Genesis chapter 50, verses 15 to 21, is one of the climactic moments in this, because Joseph has now been in Egypt for a while. He's now powerful in Egypt after a very hard and tragic backstory. He rises to power and prominence, and now his family has returned to Egypt after his brothers, of course, had sold him into slavery, assumed he was dead, did this awful, unthinkable thing to him. And now his family has returned, and now the real drama begins. What is Joseph going to do? How will he react? How will he handle seeing his family after all of this has transpired, after years have gone by since he was abused and mistreated in the most unimaginable way by his own family? How will he react? Will he continue all of these patterns that we've been reading really for the last almost 40 chapters of the book of Genesis? Will all of this continue? And this is what happens. Hear these words from the book that we love. But now that their father was dead, their father Jacob had passed away, and now it's left to the 12 brothers. Now that their father was dead, Joseph's brothers became fearful. Now Joseph will show his anger and pay us back for all the wrong we did to him, they said. So they sent this message to Joseph. Before your father died, he instructed us to say to you, please forgive your brothers for the great wrong they did to you, for their sin in treating you so cruelly. So we, the servants of the God of your father, beg you to forgive our sin. When Joseph received the message, he broke down and wept. Then his brothers came and threw themselves down before Joseph. Look, we are your slaves, they said. But Joseph replied, don't be afraid of me. Am I God, that I can punish you? You intended to harm me, but God intended it all for good. He brought me to this position so I could save the lives of many people. No, don't be afraid. I will continue to take care of you and your children. So he reassured them by speaking kindly to them. You see, Joseph acts here in mercy and wisdom and forgiveness. His inheritance, however, there was good as part of his inheritance from his family, the things that were passed down to him, but there was also a lot of baggage. Maybe some of us can relate to that. There was, for sure, lying, all the way back to Abraham and Sarah. The family line, remember, goes Abraham is the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob. Jacob had the 12 sons, and Joseph was one of them. Joseph was the favorite, in fact. Lying, Abraham lies about Sarah. Isaac and Rebekah are lied to and to each other. Jacob was known as a liar. That was like his whole thing. Like that's his reputation. And Joseph's brothers lie to their father about what happened to him after they sell him into slavery. They tell their father that he's dead. And think about this. There are like 10 of them, and they keep that secret for 10 years. Their father dies without really knowing the full truth of it. Family secrets and lying. There was favoritism in every generation. Abraham favored Isaac. Isaac favored Esau. Jacob favored Joseph, which started this whole thing with the brothers. And then once Joseph was gone and Jacob thought Joseph was dead, then he favored Benjamin. Always the favoritism. And then among siblings, of course, there was the strife. Isaac and Ishmael, and Jacob and Esau, Joseph and his brothers. Marriages were in shambles. Abraham and Sarah, the ups and downs. Isaac favored Rebekah out of his wives, and Rebekah and Leah had strife between them. And we read through Scripture and we hear these stories and we say, yeah, that sounds about right. We talk often about what it looks like to have a biblical family, and we do not mean emulating the biblical families. That's not what we mean when we say that. There are no examples, really, of what we mean when we say the biblical family. Something completely different. We have to dig down. The Bible doesn't paint a fairy tale. It's not a fairy tale land of the saints. It's real life. It's messy. And Joseph, what does he do? He is able to somehow break a lot of those patterns. He has still a deep connection and affection for his family. He breaks down and weeps and forgives them. But he also chooses to live and respond differently. He breaks some of those unhealthy cycles. So we are called, as we've been saying these last few weeks, as we talk about emotionally healthy spirituality, we have to dive down to grow up. And what that means for us is we have to look at our own families, our own family trees. However those are constructed, it can look any different way, so it applies to all of us. The first thing we really need to do is we need to face it. We need to look at this. I've talked to a lot of people, and I try to talk to them about what it was like growing up for them, or they'll tell me something maybe even a little bit negative about their family, but sometimes we're really afraid to talk about these things, right? We don't, and for good reason, we don't want to go around bashing our own families. But I've heard people say, as we try to dig down in order to grow up, and somebody will say to me, well, Pastor, it just is what it is. Why go back into the past? We need to forget about it and move on. But my question then is, does that sound like the attitude or the heart or the spirit of someone who really is desiring to be transformed in the powerful and joyful presence of Christ? If we just have this sort of resignation attitude, well, it is what it is, we can't do anything about it. Is that the attitude that Christ is calling us to have as we look at our families? No, we need to face it. We need to ask our families for stories, to map it out, and then so that we can look for patterns, to find the patterns that might have shaped us as people. What are the unwritten or unspoken rules, or maybe they were directly spoken rules of your family growing up? Have you ever stopped to think about that and think about how you have adopted some of those, sometimes consciously, but a lot of times unconsciously? And if you're not sure what I mean, like what messages we received, written or unwritten rules, well, just walk down, and I know into some discussion groups and through middle through adult after service, there's going to be a little bit, we're going to do some of this, where you actually look at some of the big topics in life, right? If you're not sure where to start, think of, well, what messages did your family send you about how to treat money and what value money has, about sex, about anger, about relationships and health, different cultures. What does success mean, really? Every family has a little bit different way of defining that, and you've absorbed that, whether you meant to or not. You learned from your family the good and the bad. But here's the catch, is that, number 3, our call as Christians is to move beyond that. And that does not mean, as I just said, it does not mean forgetting about it or ignoring it. It means diving down into it, in fact, the opposite. It means digging in, being willing to question and face it. Some of the narratives that we've been handed from our families do not line up with the truth of the gospel. Or they do not line up with just simple reality itself. I worked with a woman in Ohio, and we had a few sessions of prayer and counseling together, and mostly she just shared about her journey of dealing with anger in her life. And she was dealing with this anger, and she had always focused this anger on her father because of the way, things he had done and way he had treated his family. Her father had since passed away, and she was taking care of her ailing mother now. And she had decided to once and for all face these issues of anger that she had been dealing with, so she sought out counseling. She talked to her sibling. She talked to her mother about all these things, like where did this come from and why do I live this way? And what she figured out through all of that was that her mother had been manipulating her through all of that to hate and have anger toward her father. The reality that she thought she had lived with all these years was backwards. It was totally misguided. And now that's a really extreme example. When you go back and you analyze these things, you're probably not going to find something like that. But what it shows is that if we don't question things, if we don't dig down, if we don't analyze from a joyful perspective of God giving us the freedom and the encouragement and the courage to do that, we will not have the reality to grow and to face what we need to face, to move beyond and to live into the reality that Christ desires us to live into, instead of just living on autopilot with the things that we have been handed through our families. And so we need to be brave in doing that, to move beyond those patterns. And that comes from trusting in God, trusting that we are adopted into God's family now, and we don't just have to absorb and live with the things that our own family handed us. Now, that all sounds very negative, but don't forget, I said we inherit the sins and the blessings. When I say all this, that we need to question and dig down into our families, it's not just for the negative. But honestly, that's what most of us struggle with. We have not unmasked, we have not uncovered in our hearts and our minds and our habits what are those things that we've adopted from our families unthinkingly, and what are those things that Christ wants us to live into? And do those things line up? Are those truths line up together now that I have been adopted into the family of Christ? We don't leave our families behind, but we do move beyond in our character and in our growth. That's what we're talking about today. And I want to leave you with a picture for that. This is a picture up here of Saugatuck Dunes. There was a Friday last fall when I went for a run. And this was a Friday morning. Friday was my day off at that time. And for me, Sabbath, there's nothing better than a Sabbath than going for a walk or a run in the woods on a beautiful day. And it was fall, the leaves were blanketing the ground, and I went for this run. I hadn't been running a lot, but I kind of was like, it's a beautiful day, I'm going to stretch myself. So I ran like 5 or 6 miles, which meant I went to the farthest corner of the Saugatuck Dunes State Park and out to the beach and then back and wound my way through all the trails. And I got back. I did a couple sprints at the end. I got done, and I had to go pick up my kids. And I timed it all perfectly so I could drive back home and pick up my kids from school. And so I said, oh, look at the time. I got to go. I reached into my pocket to get the keys, and no keys. There were keys when I started running. There are no keys now. So panic starts to set in. I pull out my phone, which luckily was not locked in the car, and I called Krista. I talked to Krista. I told her what was going on, and I'm like, I don't know if I'll be able to find them. I'm not going to make it to pick up the kids. Phone dies. Boop. So luckily she got the message. They got that taken care of. Phone dies. I have no phone. I can't get into my van. And I'm dead tired. But there's only one way I am going to go anywhere. I have to go back. There is no way at that point that I can go forward if I do not go back. And I'm going to have to retrace every single step that I did because I have no idea where I lost it. Every single step on that sandy, leaf-strewn path with just one little key sitting there somewhere. I was about to cry, really, because I was so tired. I'm like, really? Is this really what I'm doing right now? But that's what I want you to remember. That even exhausted, even when it's hard, even when it doesn't sound like the most fun thing to do, there is no way to go forward in emotional health and spiritual growth if you do not at some point go back. The key is sitting in the back, in the past somewhere. Not some just magic secret, but the things that you need to move forward and grow, you're not just going to find them by forgetting all of that. You're going to have to retrace your steps. You cannot go forward until you go back. So my prayer for you is not that you would dwell in the past, but that if you do not face it, understand it, pray through it, allow God to transform it, take it to the cross, then you will not move forward as God desires for you. And God desires that deep transformation in your life. I want to invite the band to come forward. And I'm going to pray a prayer that's at the end. We've been reading through a book by Pete Scazzero for Emotionally Healthy Spirituality. I want to pray the prayer that he puts at the end of the chapter, and I want you to, please pray with me. Lord, I believe you are a God with great purposes. You placed me, you placed all of us into particular families, in particular places, in a particular time in history. I don't see what you see. But I ask you to show me, Lord, the revelation and purposes you have for me in your decision. Lord, I do not want to betray or be ungrateful for what has been given to me. Yet at the same time, help me discern what I need to let go of from my past and what my essential discipleship issues are in the present that must be addressed. Grant me courage. Grant me wisdom to learn from the past but not be crippled by it. And may I, like Joseph, be a blessing to my earthly family, spiritual family, and the world at large. In Jesus' name, amen.